Today, I'm going through the spellings of the 25 most spoken languages in the world as of 2026, and putting them on a tier list based on how phonemic I believe they are. These languages will be evaluated on how easy it is to determine how to pronounce a word based on its spelling, and vice versa, which is essentially the definition of phonemic. We won't be judging the aesthetics of spellings here, though personally I love the orthographic aesthetics of all of these languages and would put them all in S tier. No more dilly-dallying, only judgments. I do not need to tell you that English is the most spoken language in the world, or that its spelling is convoluted to the point where attempts to consistently derive spelling from pronunciation or vice versa are laughable. English's consonants are mostly fine. Their main source of ambiguity is the digraph th representing both the two dental fricatives th and the, and both it and sh occasionally being two separate consonants instead of a digraph. On the other hand, most English vowels have several ways they can be written as, and vowel letters or digraphs can often represent two or more different vowels. While there are patterns to this, which is what gives English speakers a semblance of hope of being able to guess how to say unknown words, there is absolutely no shortage of exceptions. I could go on about how stress is completely unwritten, and the several spelling mistakes native English speakers make all the time, but you should get the picture by now. English spelling is a disaster, and if it was a meal, I would refuse to eat it. D tier. Mandarin Chinese orthography is not trying to be phonemic. It uses logograms called hanzi, which primarily seek to convey meaning instead of sound. There are countless hanzi which do have a component suggesting what the character is read as, and fortunately, most hanzi only have one way they can be read as. Although there are plenty of exceptions. Most frequently, when a character can take two separate tones depending on either the dialect or characters that have different colloquial and literary readings. Still, this is a marvel in consistency compared to some languages I know! Regardless, being able to pronounce Chinese texts requires learning the readings of a few thousand hanzi. At the very least, both pinyin and bopomofo serve as fully phonemic ways to transcribe characters, at least for the standard dialect of Mandarin. With the sheer number of homophones present in Mandarin, switching the orthography to a purely phonemic spelling without any indication of meaning would be a disaster, so I wouldn't change much about how the spelling currently is. It's still going in D tier though. As a heads up, I'm not going to be ordering the languages within each tier, because I'm a lazy lizard. Next is Hindi, which is a massive step up in phonemicness. To quickly explain how Devanagari works, it's an abugida where vowels are diacritics added to consonants, except for schwa, which is inherent to consonant letters, and consonant clusters are written by combining two or more consonants into what is called a conjunct. There's a diacritic for marking nasal vowels, and a different diacritic that marks a nasal consonant cluster, serving as either ma, nya, na, or nga, depending on the following consonants. Pronunciation of Hindi words can pretty much be determined from spelling. It's worth noting that the written schwa is unpronounced much of the time, particularly at the ends of words and between a vowel-consonant pair followed by a single consonant. Determining spelling from sound is trickier, primarily caused by ambiguity whether consonant clusters should be written as conjuncts, the nasal consonant diacritic, or as a base consonant with a dropped schwa followed by a separate consonant. Sometimes Hindi spelling is flexible to where both spellings are permissible, even if one is preferred, to the point where even the spelling of the word Hindi has two different spellings, but with other words, no such leniency exists. There are also many consonants found only on loans from Sanskrit, Perso-Arabic, or English, which are pronounced the same as other consonants for some or most Hindi speakers depending on the sound. The ones from English and Perso-Arabic use a diacritic on their corresponding consonants called a nukta, which can be unwritten by speakers who don't use the sounds, but the same leniency isn't given to the Sanskrit consonant sh. Overall, I'd put Hindi in high B tier. Native Spanish words can always have their pronunciation determined from their spelling. It isn't the simplest spelling out there, a handful of rules need to be memorized, but said rules are consistent. There are exactly 5 spoken vowels to pair with the 5 written vowels, and Spanish actually bothers to indicate the stress of words. However, this applies only to native Spanish words and adapted borrowings from other languages. In modern times, however, a lot of unadapted loans have entered the language, particularly from English, which bring alongside them English's own rules and inconsistencies with spelling. This proves to be a major barrier for complete phonemicness in most European languages, which tend to spell loanwords from English, French, and others the exact same way as in their origin languages, but with oftentimes different pronunciations. There are also plenty of times when Spanish speakers don't write down the accent markers for stress, but most formal publications reliably keep them. Spanish has a lot of sounds which are written 2 separate ways, making deriving spelling from sound not possible all the time. The sound ba is spelled as either B or V, with few context clues for which letters should be used. A majority of Spanish speakers also have a merger between sa and tha, as well as ya and ya, with both consonants being spelled separately to the benefit of speakers who pronounce one or both of these pairs unmerged. The consonant pairs he and hi can also be spelled either as ge and gi, or je and ji, depending on the word. Plenty of other words have a silent h in them, which is actually pronounced in a few dialects where the h came from a historic fa sound, but there's no way of telling if the letter came from a historic fa or ha, and while rare, k and w are sometimes used in loanwords instead of their usual letters. Still, I'd put Spanish spelling in low A tier. Usually determining the sounds of a word based on its spelling is easier than the other way around, but Modern Standard Arabic is the opposite. If you know exactly how to pronounce an Arabic word, you can almost always determine its spelling. This does only apply if no consonant mergers are used, which is common across the Arab world, especially when speaking dialects. There are a few exceptions, like with ta marbuta, and the less common ways of writing the long vowel a, but of course the massive barrier preventing full phonemicness is that being an abjad, the Arabic script doesn't usually write its short vowels a, I, or u. It also doesn't indicate double consonants, or whenever the letters ya and waw are pronounced as consonants ya and wa, long vowels I and u, or diphthongs I and ow. There are helper diacritics to clear out these ambiguities, but they're only used in dictionaries, learners' materials, and sometimes in important texts such as the Quran, not in everyday Arabic for both formal and casual contexts. These diacritics also don't indicate stress at all, but stress rules are typically predictable, even if it does vary on the style of speech. The B in Arabic stands for the B tier I'm giving it. French spelling gets a lot of flack, but to its credit, determining the sounds of a French word from its spelling is actually mostly consistent. There are a bunch of spelling rules to memorize and vowels which can be written in a multitude of different ways, and there are plenty of irregularities, but a majority of written French words can have their pronunciation accurately derived based on these rules. Of course, with the sheer number of duplicate and silent letters, the spelling of French words cannot reliably be predicted based on their sounds. There are a few hints, like if a noun or adjective is feminine, it probably has a silent E, if it's plural there's probably a silent S or occasionally X, and if a consonant is ever pronounced with liaison, then the word is spelled with said consonant all the time. There are plenty of annoyances, like double consonants which are pronounced as one sound. Determining sound from spelling is also far from 100% reliable. For example, consonants such as P are usually silent at the ends of words like ku, but are pronounced in words like sep. French spelling is nowhere near as much of a mess as English, but it still has a reputation for a reason. I would get cyberbullied for putting it any higher than C tier. Bengali spelling has quite a few inconveniences, which are most prevalent in learned borrowings from Sanskrit. There is no standalone letter for the vowel a, so it's either written like ya, or with the same vowel letter as e, which causes ambiguity both with how a is written and what sound the letter for e makes. Being a Brahmic abugida, the Bengali alphabet has letters for both short e and u and long e and u to write the distinction in Sanskrit, but Bengali has no vowel length distinction, meaning the spellings of both vowels has to be memorized on a word-by-word basis. There's also separate letters for fricatives sa, sha, and sha, which are merged for a lot of Bengali speakers, meaning they have to memorize which letter is used for a given word. There are also several contexts where the geminated consonants are written as conjuncts of two separate consonants instead of the same one, and there are two letters for ja and na because of sound mergers. The inherent vowel is usually aw, but is pronounced o in various other contexts, some of which are harder to predict. Given how much consistency feels like a suggestion, I'm putting Bengali spelling in C tier. Portuguese spelling is ever so slightly less phonemic than in Spanish. Portuguese contrasts open mid and closed mid e with e and all with o, both of which are most often written with plain e and o respectively. They are usually distinguished with diacritics in words where they form minimal pairs. The distinction is only present for stressed vowels, and in Brazilian Portuguese they're the same before nasal consonants, but their contrast means a lot of Portuguese words can't have their pronunciation fully predicted just from spelling. This is much bigger of a hurdle for learners than it is for native speakers, since natives usually know the exact vowel of a given word, but it's still an inconvenience for them when encountering new words later in life. The same applies to other languages which distinguish certain vowels or other features in speech, but not writing. Portuguese fortunately doesn't have as many consonant mergers as Spanish. The main ambiguity is whether words with the consonant s should be spelled with s, ss, x, c, or c cedilla, some of which are only used for the sound in certain contexts. The letter X can also represent z, xa, sa, or sha, the latter of which is also spelled ch. The sound j can be written as either j or g before e or I. Portuguese does also fall victim to the plague of unadapted spellings with English loanwords. If it weren't for the ambiguity between the open mid and closed mid vowels, I'd put Portuguese at a very low A, but for now it's going in B tier for Brazil! With Indonesian, it's slightly easier to determine spelling from sound than the other way around. Both the vowels a and e are always spelled with e, although dictionaries and learners' materials use diacritics to distinguish them. There are also lots of loanwords with voiced obstruents in spelling, but are typically pronounced as voiceless ones, as well as consonant clusters which are often simplified down to one consonant in speech, potentially confusable as being spelled differently. Overall though, I'd give Indonesian spelling a reluctant A tier ranking. Being written with the Arabic abjad, it's impossible to reliably determine the vowel in written Urdu words. There are of course helper diacritics, but like in Arabic aren't used in everyday Urdu texts. And unlike with Arabic, spelling can't be fully determined by sounds because there are certain consonants that are used in loanwords from Arabic and Persian, but are pronounced the same as other consonants. In the most extreme case, there are 4 whole letters which can all be used for the sound za, and you just need to memorize which one to use for which word. Native Indo-Aryan words are usually immune from this inconvenience at the very least. C tier for Urdu. Writing, of course, isn't the only form a language can take. The spoken version of a language can be a completely different beast from a written language, which requires exposure either in real conversations or from visual media. And when wanting to see visual media in other languages, I like to turn from a lizard into a pie and use Lingopie. Lingopie is a streaming service catered specifically to meet the needs of language learners. I've used it to study and learn languages through gaining exposure to authentic TV shows, movies, music, audiobooks, podcasts, and the like. Lingopie is currently available for 14 languages and has over 3,000 movies and TV shows available to immerse yourself with more and more being added every day, and it's one of the largest foreign language content catalogs out there. There are plenty of tools to help out with the process of learning languages. There's a variety of speeds that you can listen to media in, the option to use subtitles in both your native language and target language at the same time, as well as an option that highlights words that are new for you. There's a ton of customization available to make Lingopie work exactly how you want it for your language learning method. Personally, I need to work on listening practice for pretty much all the languages I'm learning, so I like listening to parts of a speech and then checking the transcript to see if I understood what they were saying right. Good Morning Breakfast is a tasty show in Mandarin Chinese that I greatly enjoy watching. Lingopie keeps track of which words you've learned through it, and allows you to easily review through quizzes, flashcards, and games. If this all sounds great to you, then go click the link in the description for a free 7-day trial and 55% off the annual plan. Russian's biggest barrier to full phonemicness is the fact that stress is unwritten, when it's not only unpredictable, but also distinguishes the meanings of countless words. There are accent marks for marking stress, but they're only used in dictionaries and learners' materials. In most Russian texts, the only indicator of stress is the vowel yo, which is always stressed. But some speakers don't always write it separately from ye. Certain vowel letters also merge when unstressed, such as a and o reducing to schwa, and ye, yi, and ya reducing to ye. As such, Russian speakers often have trouble determining which vowel to write in unstressed syllables. Russian also has voicing assimilation, where at the ends of words and before voiceless consonants, obstruents are pronounced voiceless, while being pronounced voiced before other voiced obstruents. At the ends of words, it's important to still write voiced consonants as their underlying sounds, even when pronounced voiceless, because they're pronounced voiced in a lot of inflections. For example, ras in the nominative singular has the letter z pronounced as a voiceless sound, but in the genitive singular it's pronounced voiced, as in raza. Consonants are often written doubled even when pronounced as a single consonant, and there are a few other quirks such as written consonant clusters getting simplified in speech, and V being written with the letter for G in some contexts. I could see Russian spelling being placed in B tier, but for the pain it's caused me and doubtless many others, I'm putting it in C for cursive. Why do I mention cursive? No reason. German orthography is fairly consistent, but still has several things preventing it from being fully phonemic. A key principle of German orthography is that there are 8 vowel letters, each with a corresponding short and long vowel. The vowels are pronounced long when less than 2 consonant letters, or the letter H follows them, and are usually pronounced short when 2 or more consonants follow them. There are, however, plenty of exceptions, so these rules are not fully reliable to determine the length of German vowels. Sometimes H is written after vowel letters even when the vowel would already be regularly pronounced long in that context, and is something to memorize from word to word. There's also devoicing of word final obstruents, loanwords from English and French with unchanged spellings, and if you want to be picky, German requires that all nouns have the first letter capitalized, but you can't always tell if a word is a noun or not just by how it's pronounced. Overall though, I'd say German spelling is just straightforward enough to where I'd give it a low A tier. Japanese is our first and only F tier for this video. It is often considered to be one of, if not the hardest language to learn how to write in. Hiragana and katakana are mostly phonemic, minus the fact that they leave pitch accent completely unwritten, but kanji can make written Japanese a living nightmare. While Chinese kanzi usually only have 1 or 2 readings, Japanese kanji can potentially have up to too many. Kanji as a basis have at least 1 native Japanese reading and 1 reading borrowed from Chinese, and there are patterns for which of these 2 types of reading to use, but these patterns are very often not followed. The readings of kanji pretty much have to be learned on a word-by-word basis, as there are countless irregularities sprinkled all across the written language. Not to mention the mental gymnastics required to guess how to pronounce a person's name based on the spelling or vice versa. Plenty of words are written only with kana fortunately, and furigana written before kanji helps greatly by indicating what readings a given kanji is meant to have, but is primarily used in signs, for children's media, and for learners. Go watch Lazy Fluency's kanji iceberg video if you want a deeper dive, but for now we're moving on. Nigerian Pidgin is a very interesting case. Being a Creole language used primarily in informal contexts in a country with a relatively low literacy rate, Nigerian Pidgin is not written down very often. When written down in the context of linguistic analyses of the language, Nigerian Pidgin can be fully phonemic both ways. In the real world, however, it appears that Nigerian Pidgin is written largely the same as English, but with plenty of words written phonemically based on the way they're pronounced in the language, although even these words make no effort to write down the 2 tones at all. Dear Nigerian government, written Nigerian Pidgin is still young. It's not too late to regulate the language and make it so that it's spelled fully phonetically. Please, that would be so cool. For now, I'm putting Nigerian spelling into C tier. Pretty much all the things that apply to modern Standard Arabic also apply to Egyptian Arabic. Although being primarily a colloquial language, Egyptian Arabic isn't written down as often. The dental fricatives tha, tha, and from MSA shifted to ta, da in Egyptian Arabic. Although for learned borrowings with the sounds, they're pronounced as fricatives sa, za, and instead. There's also phonological processes where certain clusters of sounds get pronounced differently than written, and there are more vowels in Egyptian Arabic than MSA. Overall, the phonemicness is about the same as modern Standard Arabic, but a little less. I would give the spelling of Egyptian Arabic a C-tier ranking, alongside most other colloquial Arabic dialects, like Levantine and Moroccan Arabic. The Marathi language of central India primarily uses Devanagari as Hindi does, but like Bengali, it has letters for short and long E and U despite not distinguishing between vowel length, spelling them generally based on their Sanskrit origins. There are some patterns, like how the long forms of the letters are used much more often at the ends of words, and the short U is overall twice as common as long U, but these aren't fully reliable rules. The sequence Ru can be written down one of 3 ways depending on how it was in the original Sanskrit. Additionally, the letter H is often dropped when coming after a vowel, often causes the schwa before it to be unpronounced, but marks sonorants as breathy voiced. Marathi also has the alveolar affricates tsa, za, and za, with no letters to write them distinctly from cha, ja, and ja. So the pronunciation of words with their corresponding letters can't be fully determined based on spelling. Marathi spelling is going in B tier. After 16 whole languages, we finally have one where the way to pronounce a word can pretty much always be determined by its spelling, with Vietnamese. Unfortunately, determining spelling based on pronunciation is quite a bit more difficult. The northern, southern, and central dialects of Vietnamese all have different consonant mergers, and written Vietnamese is based on the unmerged sounds of Middle Vietnamese from which they all descended. For example, in the north the letters S and X are pronounced the same, while in the south they're different. But both varieties are written the same, so the distinction is also written in the north. Likewise, the north has the sounds na and nga distinguished at the ends of syllables, whereas in the south they merged. Although vowels are mostly the same across the dialects, Southern Vietnamese has merged the tones nga and hoi, which again, are written differently regardless, making them something to memorize for speakers of Southern Vietnamese. The vowel e when not preceded by wa is prescribed to always be written as I, but oftentimes people spell the vowel as y, particularly in personal names and Chinese loanwords. The standalone letter y can't be pronounced as anything else besides e though, so either spelling is typically understandable, and this isn't too much of an inconvenience. There are a few unadapted loanwords, particularly from English, but they aren't nearly as common as in European languages. Having to distinguish the same sounds in spelling because they're pronounced differently in other dialects can be a bit of a pain, but there's no better way to do it while still keeping written Vietnamese mostly the same between dialects, so for that I'd still give Vietnamese A tier. The Telugu language spoken in south-central India has spelling that isn't flawless, but is imperfect in ways that hardly matter at all. The diphthongs I and ao are spelled either with the diphthong letters, or a consonant with a short a followed by yi or vu. But most words with this sound can be spelled either way. The sounds a, ta, and za are spelled the same as a, cha, and ja respectively, but their status as phonemes is so marginal that I think that deserves a pass. The standalone vowels e, u, and o are spelled differently than their allophones yi, ye, wu, and vo, but the former set is always used at the starts of words, while the latter set is used elsewhere in the word. I believe Telugu spelling is the first S tier of this video. Next up is Swahili, which gets so unbelievably close to achieving a perfect spelling that I'm close to tearing my eyebrows out. I believe that Swahili spelling can be fully determined from a word's sounds, at least for some speakers. While all syllables in Swahili native words are an optional consonant followed by a vowel, with an optional ya or wa in between, and the syllabic nasal also present, loanwords also have the glides la and ra, which some people pronounce with an u in between. And likewise, consonant clusters exist in other loans in words like rasmi, which I'm not sure ever have vowels inserted. There are also the phonemes tha, the, kha, and gha from Arabic, which are not distinguished by all speakers. The distinction is typically made by native Swahili speakers along the Swahili coast, but for other speakers they're pronounced the same as ta, da, ka, and ga, despite being spelled differently. None of these are the deciding blow. I have no trouble believing that there are Swahili speakers out there that have all of these phonological features, and can therefore freely interchange the spelling and pronunciation of them. However, there's the syllabic nasal that I mentioned earlier, and it can come before the sounds ba and va, but the digraphs mb and mv also represent the prenasalized consonants mba and mva, creating a barely audible but still dreadful ambiguity. It is the case that with class 1 and class 3 nouns, the M is always pronounced as a syllabic nasal. Still, for being able to determine sounds for spelling about 99% of the time, Swahili spelling ends up firmly in S tier. The Hausa language of northern Nigeria and southern Niger also has the potential to be fully phonemic in both directions, keyword potential. While yet again, dictionaries and linguistic analyses use diacritics to indicate the distinctions Hausa makes with tones and vowel length, they're unfortunately not found in real written Hausa, either in news publications or casual use. They also don't distinguish R from R tilde, representing the retroflex tap and alveolar trill respectively, but compared to not writing length or tone, that is a very minor inconvenience. At the very least, spelling can be fully determined from sounds without any trouble. B tier for Hausa because every single written vowel can be pronounced 5 different ways depending on the length and tone. Turkish also gets close to being phonemic in both directions, but falls short for 2 relatively small reasons. While not as distinctive as in German, Telugu, or Hausa, Turkish has long vowels, which are written either as the normal vowel followed by a soft G in native words, or with the circumflex diacritic to mark the long vowels a, e, and u in loans from Arabic, although sometimes this diacritic isn't written at all, particularly when the length does not form a minimal pair. Stress is also not indicated, but it's fairly minor in Turkish. Turkish also has word final plosive devoicing like in Russian and German, but unlike those languages reflects this in spelling. writing kitab with a P instead of the underlying phoneme ba, which makes determining spelling easier at the expense of being slightly more difficult for learners because spelling doesn't indicate whether it becomes voiced after other inflections. Overall though, I'd still put Turkish comfortably in A tier. To get a bit meta, Ethnologue splits Punjabi into Eastern and Western, whether or not they're spoken in India or Pakistan. The varieties of Punjabi get really divergent to the point where I understand if you consider some to be separate languages, but speech-wise, it's inaccurate to say the dialectal boundary should be drawn at the India-Pakistan border. With writing on the other hand, it's a valid cutoff, since Punjabi uses the Gurmukhi Abugida in India and Shahbaki in Pakistan, which for most purposes functions the same as the Urdu alphabet, with the addition of several letters for sounds found in Punjabi, and for the same reasons as Urdu, belongs in C tier in my opinion. Formal Tagalog is almost fully phonemic, whenever stress is written down like in dictionaries and learning resources, but speakers never write down the highly contrastive stress. The same is true for glottal stops at the ends of words, which are unwritten outside of accent marks. While more formally, English loanwords are written in accordance with Tagalog spelling conventions. With the way most Filipinos write Tagalog, they generally spell English loanwords the same as they are in English, making it less phonemic. Although it's fair to analyze this as being a trait of Taglish rather than pure Tagalog. A tier for the language either way. Tamil, spoken in the southern tip of India and parts of Sri Lanka, is interesting to analyze for this to say the least, since formal and colloquial Tamil are basically two separate languages. Formal Tamil is almost fully phonemic, besides the fact that the tap ra and trill ra, which used to be distinguished in speech and still are in writing, have merged for most speakers. In formal Tamil, plosives are either voiced or unvoiced strictly depending on their environment, like always being voiceless at the starts of words, but in colloquial Tamil, there are loanwords where voice consonants appear at the start, which is not reflected in writing. For example, the word boss is spelled like it's pronounced boss. There are also many colloquial dialects with merged phonemes, particularly with the liquids. Overall, I think Tamil deserves an A on the tier list, but I could see others giving it a B. We finally reached the 25th and last language of our discussion, Yue Chinese, better known for its most spoken variety, Cantonese. Yue Chinese is primarily a colloquial language and isn't written down as often, but when it is, has about the same orthographic system and functions as Mandarin does. The grammar is fairly different, and there are plenty of words used in Cantonese but not Mandarin, but most words are spelled the same when discarding the simplified traditional split. Most other varieties of Chinese also use the same general system of Chinese characters, and I will put them all also in D tier. And here's the full tier list of all 25 written languages. If you speak any languages not featured in this list, feel free to comment which tier you'd put their written form in. That's it, subscribe baby, bye!